June 23, 1944. The early morning mist clung to the French countryside, curling around shattered hedgerows and abandoned farmhouses, carrying with it the metallic tang of gun oil, smoke, and the faint, haunting scent of earth churned by tanks. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of engines began to stir, a sound that promised chaos and destruction. Soldiers tightened straps on their helmets, fingers trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, eyes scanning the horizon where the first glimmers of sunlight danced across the steel hulls of approaching German panzers. For Captain Michael Whitman, commanding one of the German Waffen, SS's most formidable Tiger I tanks, every morning brought a test of skill, courage, and luck. The Battle of Villers, Bocage was already underway, and he knew that a single bold move could turn the tide, or spell disaster for his comrades. He had spent weeks memorizing the terrain, studying the enemy's likely movements, and calculating the angle and timing that could give him a fleeting advantage in a war that had already claimed so many lives. But this morning was different. The air was charged with tension, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting to see what would unfold. The story of this engagement begins not with glory, but with preparation. Villers, Bocage, a quiet market town before the war, had become a deadly chessboard. Narrow streets lined with stone houses offered both cover and traps. Tanks could be concealed behind corners, infantry could vanish into cellars and gardens, and artillery could rain death from a distance. Whitman's intelligence reports indicated that a British armored column was advancing through the town, their Shermans and Cromwells moving steadily toward Caen, unaware that a Tiger I lay in wait. The Tiger I itself was a marvel of engineering, heavy, nearly 57 tons of pure steel, with a powerful 88 Bevier gun capable of piercing almost any Allied tank at long range. Its thick armor made it nearly impervious to the standard British 6-pounder or 75 bomb rounds, giving Whitman a dangerous advantage. But it also came with vulnerabilities. The tank's weight made it slow to maneuver, and the exhaust, heavy engine could betray its position to anyone listening closely. Whitman's challenge was to use both the tank's strengths and the terrain to orchestrate a devastating ambush. He studied the streets carefully, imagining every movement of the approaching enemy. What would they do if they saw a Tiger crouched behind a building? How far could he push the advantage before exposing himself? These thoughts played in his mind as he scanned the horizon, but he didn't have time for hesitation. Every second counted. Nearby, his crew, a carefully chosen team who had fought with him through Normandy, prepared the ammunition, checked optics, and listened for the faintest whisper of enemy engines. By mid-morning, the British column entered the town. The noise of engines, the clatter of tracks over cobblestones, and the occasional shout of advancing infantry filled the air. From a distance, this looked like any other armored push, but Whitman had already chosen his moment. His Tiger I waited at a carefully concealed corner, the massive gun barrel barely visible, angled perfectly to sweep. The road, every detail mattered: the angle of approach, the timing of the first shot, and the knowledge that if he missed, the element of surprise, and perhaps his life, would be gone. Then it began. A Sherman tank appeared first, cautious but unaware of the steel predator lying in wait. Whitman's hands were steady on the controls, heart hammering with anticipation. He had only one chance. The 88 Bevier gun roared, a deafening blast that echoed through the streets, sending smoke curling into the sky. The Sherman erupted in a ball of fire, debris scattered across the cobblestones, and the sound of enemy soldiers scrambling filled the air. Whitman did not pause. The next target was already coming into view. What followed over the next few hours would become a textbook case of tactical genius and deadly precision. Whitman moved his tank with a careful blend of aggression and caution, using the narrow streets, garden walls, and abandoned vehicles as cover. Each shot was deliberate, each movement calculated. British tanks were destroyed one after another, their crews stunned, often never knowing where the fatal rounds had come from. By the end of the morning, the column had been decimated. Over 50 enemy vehicles were put out of action, and the surviving soldiers retreated in chaos, unable to comprehend the sudden destruction that had fallen upon them. Yet, this was not simply a story of metal and firepower. It was a story of human tension and split-second decisions. Whitman's courage, and the courage of his crew, was matched by the terror and confusion of those caught in their path. The smell of burning fuel, the acrid smoke of gunpowder, the trembling ground under the treads of advancing and destroyed tanks, all combined to create a sensory landscape that no soldier could forget. Every moment carried the weight of life and death, the thin line between survival and annihilation. Meanwhile, back at command posts and observation points across Normandy, reports came in of the carnage. Allied commanders struggled to understand how a single tank, maneuvered by a single commander, could inflict such devastating losses. Engineers studied the Tiger Eye's capabilities, analysts reviewed aerial photographs, and soldiers whispered stories of the ghost tank that had appeared, struck, and vanished like a shadow. Whitman had not simply used a tank, he had used knowledge, preparation, and audacity to create a deadly force multiplier. Even today, historians examine this engagement for its tactical brilliance. Maps are drawn and redrawn, memoirs are consulted, and photographs are scrutinized, all to reconstruct the moment when one man's decision changed the course of a battle in a small French town. But behind the numbers and strategies were real human experiences, the fear in the eyes of advancing crews, the tension in Whitman's cabin, and the sense of inevitability that hangs over any battlefield. As the smoke cleared over Villers, Bocage, the town itself bore silent witness. Charred tanks, craters in the cobblestones, and shattered buildings told a story far louder than any report. Whitman's bold gamble had succeeded, but the cost of victory, the psychological strain, the fleeting nature of survival, and the reminder of mortality, was etched into every corner, every scorched surface. For those who had witnessed it, and for those who would read the history later, the lesson was clear: warfare is not just a contest of weapons, but of minds, nerves, and daring calculated risks. And so, in the quiet aftermath, the Tiger Eye crouched among the ruins, a symbol of both power and peril. Whitman knew the battle was far from over, that every decision from this point forward would carry weight, and that history was already beginning to take notice. The story of one man, one tank, and one audacious plan had begun to ripple outward, changing lives, shaping strategies, and leaving an indelible mark on the narrative of the Second World War. By late morning, the streets of Villers, Bocage had become a deadly maze. The British armored column had split into smaller groups, some attempting to push forward, others hesitating under the weight of uncertainty. Smoke curled from destroyed tanks, filling the air with a choking mix of burning fuel and scorched metal. The ground shook intermittently under the rumble of distant artillery, and somewhere, the faint, anxious cries of infantry carried on the wind. Every shadow could hide a tank, every corner could conceal an enemy. For Whitman and his crew, every second demanded focus, anticipation, and nerve. Whitman's Tiger Eye moved with an almost predatory grace. Despite its massive size, it weaved through narrow streets with precision, the tracks crunching over cobblestones and rubble. From his periscope, he studied the advancing Shermans, each a potential threat but also a target. The Tiger's 8A Bumbium gun was lethal at range, and Whitman exploited every advantage the terrain offered. A hedgerow, a garden wall, a slight rise in the street, each became a natural shield, allowing him to strike before the enemy could respond. His crew worked in near-perfect synchronization, loading shells, adjusting the gun, and communicating silently through gestures and brief commands. The first Sherman that had been destroyed was only the beginning. Another appeared around the corner, turret rotating, crew scanning for threats. Whitman's finger rested lightly on the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, a single, devastating shot. The shell impacted the Sherman, piercing its armor and detonating inside. The sound was deafening, a blast that echoed through the narrow streets, reverberating against stone walls. Smoke and fire erupted, sending debris into the air, and the remaining British tanks hesitated, trying to regroup. Whitman knew hesitation was weakness, and he pressed his advantage. Over the next hour, the engagement became a deadly dance. Whitman used a combination of ambush tactics, careful positioning, and rapid target prioritization to dismantle the enemy column. One tank after another was disabled. Crew members later described the surreal sight of a lone Tiger moving almost invisibly through the streets, striking with devastating precision, and disappearing into cover before the British could mount an effective counterattack. The psychological impact was enormous. Soldiers reported fear and confusion, as though a ghostly predator hunted them through the town. Every maneuver was calculated. Whitman understood the limitations of the tiger eye. The slow turret traverse, the heavy weight, the susceptibility to close, range attacks from infantry. He avoided open squares where ambushes could catch him, hugging walls and moving through constricted streets. He also exploited the tiger's firepower, engaging targets from distances where the 88 mm gun could penetrate Sherman armor with near certainty. Tactical patience, combined with audacity, defined his approach. Meanwhile, chaos unfolded on the streets. British infantry attempted to provide cover for their tanks, but the shock of unexpected losses slowed coordination. Smoke and flames created a near-apocalyptic scene. Burning vehicles, shattered stone, overturned carts, and debris strewn across the cobblestones. Whitman pressed forward, firing carefully selected shots, each one a calculated risk. At one point, he paused behind a corner, listening for movement, analyzing which tanks were operational and which were vulnerable. Every choice carried life or death stakes, not only for him but for his crew and the men around him. Amid this devastation, there were moments that seemed almost cinematic in their tension. A British tank appeared unexpectedly from a side street, its barrel trained directly on Whitman's Tiger. Time seemed to slow. The Tiger's commander took a deep breath, calculated the trajectory, and fired. The shell struck with lethal accuracy, destroying the Sherman before it could return fire. Such moments repeated throughout the battle, blending adrenaline, skill, and sheer nerve. Whitman's crew later recalled the unspoken bond of trust in those seconds, where hesitation could mean death. Interestingly, Whitman's tactical brilliance was not purely about aggression. He also used deception and misdirection. At times, he allowed a small tank to advance slightly, then struck from a concealed angle, creating confusion in the enemy ranks. British soldiers later described the Tiger as everywhere at once, a single tank appearing and disappearing as if by magic. In reality, it was Whitman's deep understanding of terrain, vehicle capability, and human psychology that made this possible. Throughout the engagement, Whitman also made use of intelligence gathered prior to the battle. He knew the likely routes of the British column, their probable stopping points, and the limited visibility in certain streets. By positioning his Tiger at key choke points and anticipating enemy movements, he effectively controlled the battlefield. Even when the enemy attempted flanking maneuvers, Whitman adapted quickly, moving his tank to intercept, firing with precision, and then retreating to cover before the British could respond. By mid-afternoon, the result was undeniable. Over 50 enemy vehicles had been destroyed or disabled. The streets were littered with burning Shermans, twisted metal, and abandoned equipment. The British column had fractured and retreated, leaving the town in German hands. Whitman's bold gamble, the decision to engage aggressively and exploit every advantage, had succeeded beyond expectations. But the cost of such brilliance was visible in the war-torn town itself, the scars of battle etched into every building, street, and cobblestone. Yet, beyond the destruction, there was a human story. Whitman's crew endured extreme stress, their nerves stretched to the limit, senses constantly alert to movement, sound, and vibration. They experienced moments of fear, exhilaration, and grim determination. Each successful shot was both a relief and a reminder of the stakes. The British crews, in contrast, faced chaos, confusion, and a growing sense of helplessness as their numbers dwindled. Observers on both sides later noted the almost surreal nature of the engagement, a small town transformed into a crucible of skill, courage, and deadly precision. Historians have since analyzed this action in detail. Tactical maps, battlefield reports, and eyewitness accounts reveal the extraordinary combination of factors that allowed one Tiger Eye and its commander to achieve such devastating results. It was not merely luck, nor was it brute force alone. It was a fusion of engineering, preparation, anticipation, and audacity, a perfect storm of battlefield mastery. Every angle, every shot, and every decision played a role in a moment of history that would be studied for decades. As the smoke began to clear, Whitman did not linger. He knew the importance of movement, of avoiding counterattacks, and of preserving both his tank and crew for the days ahead. The battlefield was littered with destruction, but also with lessons. lessons in human courage, the deadly power of mechanized warfare, and the profound impact of decisive action in moments of crisis. For those who survived the day, and for historians who later pieced together the events, the engagement at Villers Bocage became a symbol of both the terror and the brilliance that defined tank warfare during the Second World War. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over Villers Bocage, the streets were cloaked in a surreal haze of smoke, dust, and the lingering smell of burnt oil. The sounds of battle had faded into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by distant artillery and the occasional collapse of a damaged building. Yet the war was far from over. Whitman's Tiger Eye, though victorious, remained exposed, and the town itself was a maze of threats: hidden infantry, sniper fire, and unexploded ordnance. Every step forward required vigilance, every decision a potential gamble. Whitman knew he could not linger. His mission was not simply destruction, it was survival and the preservation of his tank and crew for the battles yet to come. He moved with the same calculated precision that had defined the morning, weaving through narrow streets and using every piece of cover the shattered town could provide. The British, despite their heavy losses, were regrouping. Smaller units began to probe from unexpected angles, testing the Tiger's position, searching for vulnerabilities. Whitman had anticipated this. He was ready. Suddenly, a column of Cromwell tanks appeared at a distance, advancing cautiously through a side street. Whitman's eyes narrowed through the periscope. There was no time for hesitation. Every second counted. He angled his tank just right, using a ruined wall as partial concealment, and fired the first shell. The impact was devastating. The lead Cromwell erupted in flames, blocking the path of the following tanks. Chaos ensued. British infantry scrambled, artillery shells landed nearby, and for a moment, the battlefield seemed to hang in suspended chaos. Whitman did not pause. Another shot, another vehicle disabled. The psychological shock was as effective as the physical destruction. In these critical hours, Whitman demonstrated a rare combination of technical mastery, nerves of steel, and intuitive understanding of human behavior. He exploited hesitation, fear, and confusion, turning them into tactical advantages. Observers later noted that his maneuvers resembled a deadly chess game, each step forcing the enemy into a trap they scarcely realized they were walking into. Whitman was not simply reacting, he was dictating the flow of battle, controlling both terrain and the emotions of those he faced. Amid this destruction, there were narrow escapes. One British tank managed to fire at point-blank range, the shell skimming past Whitman's turret, leaving a metallic scratch along the armor. Another close encounter with infantry, armed with anti-tank weapons, reminded the crew of the constant peril. These moments of tension were brief but visceral. Adrenaline surging, hearts racing, and the sense of mortality pressing in. Whitman's decisions in these moments, when to fire, when to retreat, and when to advance, illustrated the razor-thin margin between success and disaster. By late afternoon, the battle had reached its apex. 50 enemy vehicles were destroyed or incapacitated, the British column scattered and demoralized. Villers Bocage lay in ruin, but Whitman and his crew remained alive, their Tiger Eye battle tested yet intact. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Reports of the engagement traveled quickly through both Allied and German channels. Whitman became a figure of almost legendary status, a symbol of precision, audacity, and the terrifying efficiency of mechanized warfare. But the human cost was impossible to ignore. Civilians had fled or been trapped, streets were littered with twisted metal and scorched debris, and the emotional toll on soldiers, friend and foe alike, was immense. Whitman's crew, despite their success, were exhausted, their senses stretched to the limit. For a brief moment after the fighting ended, they allowed themselves to breathe, reflecting on the thin line they had walked between survival and death. Historians have since scrutinized this engagement, dissecting maps, photographs, and first-hand accounts. They note how Whitman's combination of intelligence, preparation, and calculated risk produced extraordinary results. The Tiger Eye was a formidable machine, but it was Whitman's skill, patience, and boldness that made it a nearly unstoppable force in those hours. His story is not just about technology, it is about decision-making under extreme pressure, the interplay of psychology and mechanics, and the human capacity for both courage and calculated audacity. Even decades later, the Battle of Villars, Bocage offers lessons for military strategy, engineering, and human behavior. Modern commanders study the engagement to understand the impact of terrain, surprise, and decision-making speed. Engineers examine the Tiger Eye's design to comprehend how technology can be maximized in skilled hands. And ordinary observers are reminded that history is shaped not only by armies and machines, but by individuals who take risks and exercise judgment in moments that matter most. As dusk settled over the town, Whitman's Tiger Eye receded into the shadows, its treads leaving deep impressions in the cobblestones. The battlefield was silent except for the distant echo of artillery and the soft whisper of wind through ruined rooftops. The story of one tank commander's audacious gamble had concluded, but its echoes would reverberate through history. It was a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and the extraordinary consequences that can emerge when preparation meets opportunity under the most extreme circumstances. And as we reflect on these events today, we are reminded that warfare is more than strategy or machinery. It is a story of people, of fear, hope, courage, and the human capacity to act decisively in moments that define the course of history. Captain Michael Whitman's actions at Villars, Bocage remain a powerful example of this truth, a story that invites us to consider the complexities of conflict, the weight of responsibility, and the thin line between success and disaster. If you found yourself captivated by the audacity, skill, and tension of this battle, consider what it teaches us about human decision-making, courage, and the hidden forces that shape history. Share your thoughts. How would you react in a moment that demands both precision and daring? The story of Villars, Bocage reminds us that history is alive, shaped by choices, and remembered not only for victories and losses, but for the extraordinary human moments that define them.